Hello, Lady here. Today we're checking out the Thermaltake Level 20 VT. Now, this is quite a complex case to review for a certain number of factors, mainly being that there are a lot of visual options with this case in terms of panel layouts and that sort of thing, but there are also a lot of what would appear to be options but aren't quite supported, so I need to go through those as well, and none of which is really well covered at all in the user manual. There's really not a lot explaining what can go where and what can't go in certain places, and what certain things going in certain areas will deny in terms of support for radiators, that sort of thing. So I'll cover all of those in the core 25-minute review, but I understand that is a long review for a lot of people to get the more specific information they want. So if you want to skip to any particular part of the video, you can head to the video description or the first pinned comment, and there will be timestamps laid out there, so you can click on it and skip to the unboxing, to the installation, thermals, to the end where we do the conclusion of the pros, cons, missed opportunities segment, so everything is guaranteed to be covered. If you want to check out how much this costs in your various regions, then you can head to the Amazon affiliate links in the video description, and if you purchase this or anything else through there, like toilet paper or whatever you fancy, then it will give a small kickback to the channel. Now, if you want to know why I've got blue LED lighting at the top, but green LED lighting at the bottom, then you'll have to wait to the end in the conclusion, and I'll explain it there. I think that's enough of a hook. I think most people will stay throughout the whole video to see that. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into the unboxing. As with all cases, I'm well behind the trend on this one. Anyway, the Level 20 VT is one of Thermaltake's 20-year anniversary cases, and it appears they've gone for a reasonably high-end case, and with that, a reasonably high-end cost of around £100 or $100. This is bound to be an exceptionally long video since there are so many potential variants to cover. So quickly breaking through the cardboard and closed-cell polystyrene packaging, we soon meet the Thermaltake Level 20 VT. We'll start off by taking a good look at the exterior, working towards the interior. As seen a few seconds ago, this case comes with 4 tempered glass panels, one to the front, one to each side, and one up top, and they're all 4mm thick. Up top is where we find the front I/O, which consists of separate microphone and headphone jacks, 2 USB 3.0 and 2.0 ports, the reset button, drive activity LED, and power button. Something I wanted to bring to your attention from the get-go is exactly what you're looking at here. So taking a step back, it's obvious where the glass is, but it might not be so obvious where the plastic is and metal is. So this is all the plastic, and this is all the metal. Now let me help you out there. Now I'm not saying it's a bad thing, and I mean that. I'm a strong advocate for brushed plastic over aluminium, since aluminium just gets damaged way too easily. So I just wanted to point it out to temper everyone's expectations. Moving on to the rear contains the business end of the case. Starting from the top, we have a 120 or 140mm fan position, or radiator position if that's what you're into, a tubing grommet to the right, and the PCI Express slots just below that. The rear I/O position is to the left, with an ATX power supply unit position below that, and the ventilation section to the lower right leads through to the 3.5-inch drive cage, which will encourage some exhaust airflow to trickle through the drives. The base of the case also has plenty going on. Right under the front panel is a cutout to grab onto for removing the panel, and just below is a vent with room for a couple of 120mm fans, mounted on the inside of course. Further to the rear of the case is the intake vent and filter for the power supply unit, and in this case a bottom power supply unit. Intake is pretty much a necessity. Choose your power supply unit wisely. While we're down here, the feet aren't anything special. They're essentially a plastic body with a foam pad attached, which sounds like a bad thing, and while I'd like to see more steel around, I mean, who wouldn't, the foam feet really help with shifting the case on the desk once it's been packed with a system. So that's the exterior taken care of. Let's get these panels off and check out the chassis. All panels apart from the front can be removed from the rear after taking out a couple of thumb screws each. The panels all hook onto the front of the case and need sliding to the rear to disengage the connection. For the side panels, you'll want to make sure you have a hand to hold the panel in place once the last screw has been removed, and have the other hand ready to catch the panel since there's no panel retention mechanism in place. As for the front, grabbing onto the handle-like cutout seen earlier, there is quite a lot of force required to remove the panel. I've always been more of a fan of pinching the plastic clips from the inside to make this process a little less jarring, just to help prevent any potential damage or accidental drops. Now this isn't a build guide, but when it comes to more expensive cases, it's always worth packing the side panels away and using the foam that came with the case to prevent them from all clattering together. Then they can all be shifted out of the way so they're all safe. Also notice I haven't removed the plastic film from the side panels yet, just in case something goes wrong. And final point on these side panels, it always helps to replace the screws where you found them wherever you can, just so they don't get lost. We'll deal with the accessories bag next, since it's in the way of the rest of the chassis overview and the build. This is going to come across as nitpicky, and it is, but in terms of attention to detail, I don't think piercing a plastic bag with a wire tie and strapping it to the front I/O cables is what I'd expect or want to find from a £100 case. Sure, it doesn't matter all that much, but companies like Fractal Design and Silverstone put more attention to detail in these sorts of areas, and it's a nice to have. Anyway, in terms of accessories, to the right we have all the various screws and wire ties you require for most builds in this case. If you need more than this, then you should find them with the other components you purchase. And the rest of the hardware here is for the optional power supply unit bracket, which we'll cover in a second, but as far as I can tell, it's only required for the heaviest of power supply units. Just before we get onto that power supply unit bracket, we're going to strip the rest of the chassis down so we have complete freedom of movement. First, the front I/O can be removed. It's only held in place by a single screw and a set of hooks into the chassis. These can be disengaged with a slide to the right. Below the I/O is a 200mm fan, which can be coupled with a 200mm radiator, as long as it has 180mm separated screw spacings, something we'll be throwing into a water-cooled build soon. This one spins up to 800 RPM, which is nice and quiet, and is held in place with a set of long screws. Flipping the case over, we can remove the base panel of the case ready to install the power supply unit bracket set. As you saw earlier, there are two brackets, and these need installing to the rear of the power supply unit position. The longest one gets screwed into the side of the chassis, and the shorter one gets secured to the end of the first one with a screw, and then hooks into a fold in the motherboard tray. This isn't necessary for the majority of power supply units. The back of the case will do the job by itself for any 160mm power supply unit, but for 180mm or larger power supply units, I'd probably go ahead and install it. However, I'm not fully convinced the hook to the motherboard tray was the best option, but I suppose it's more convenient than getting a screwdriver in here. Anyway, rounding the power supply unit bracket off, it comes with a set of rubber pads to reduce vibrations from the fan of the unit. Moving to the front, this is where we start our dive into the layout options of this case. The front I/O can be fixed to any side of the case, so it can be mounted to the top, either side of the case, and even at the bottom if you're into challenging setups. Something you may have noticed is the colour of the PCB. It's green. This doesn't bother me since there's no way you'll be able to see it once it's installed, and with any luck the saving over a black PCB was invested into another area of the case. I was slightly annoyed by the corrosion on the one that I picked up, which looks like some very minor moisture damage, and come to think of it, there wasn't any silica gel included, which could have prevented this. Anyway, while we're down here, we can check out the hooks that hold the I/O unit to the chassis in its various positions. Now, thinking back to when I mentioned the I/O could be placed on the bottom of the chassis, well, while that's true, it doesn't tell the whole story. But rather than just tell, I'd like to show you that this chassis is a square-based cuboid with attachment points to every side. So rather than have the I/O on the base, you can rotate the case around and have the motherboard vertically positioned, or flipped, or even upside down. And the I/O can be placed on the 3 available sides, more on this later. Back to the front, we have 4 front I/O cable routing holes to support each orientation. The front can support up to a 240 or 200mm radiator, but not a 280mm radiator. However, it can support 2 120 or 140mm fans, and comes with a 200mm fan. But something to keep an eye out for is the cutout at the top. Now, there's no explanation for this in the manual, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this looks to me like a mounting position via the holes either side for a cylindrical reservoir with a view from the front. Up top, there's a really interesting set of rails for mounting fans, radiators, and anything else you can use 120, 140, and 200mm mounting holes. To keep track of what can be fixed where, the rails are etched, with guidance to show which holes can support certain mounting sizes. And at the back, the right and left rail order is etched just to make sure you don't mount the radiator the wrong way around. The other side of these rails are pierced through the front of the chassis to hold them in place. This of course leaves a little wiggle room, which may be problematic if you're just mounting fans, but radiators would do a much better job of preventing movement through their sheer weight. To remove a rail, a small latch to the rear needs lifting, which allows the front to slide out of the slot in the chassis, at which point the rail can be lifted away. In terms of top mounting compatibility, it can fit two 240mm radiators, a 240 and 280mm radiator, or a single 200mm radiator, and their respective equivalent of fans. There is also support for the rails on the sides that can take a 240 or 280mm radiator, but this isn't documented in the manual. It also has to be said at this point, which I will repeat later when I discover it, if you want to mount a fan or radiator to the sides, you won't get any clearance from the side panel unless you use the top glass panel, and there's only one of them. This is one of the few restrictions of this case that isn't obvious from the outset, nor has it been reported very well. Anyway, shifting our attention to the drive mounting capacity of this case, it's pretty good news here. To the side are three 2.5-inch drive sleds that are all held in place by a single thumb screw. These can be arranged in any manner you like across the many preset screws in the motherboard backplate, or they can be removed if you need them to be. Over the other side is what looks like a similar setup, but unfortunately you can't slot these 2.5-inch drive sleds here. I'm not too concerned by this, but I think it's a potential missed opportunity, one of many in this case. Moving on to 3.5-inch drive support, underneath the motherboard tray is a 3.5-inch drive cage with 3 drive sleds. Each drive sled can be removed from the inside, and installation of a 3.5-inch drive requires flexing the sledge to engage the pins with the screw holes on the sides of the drives. These sleds can also support 2.5-inch drives if you need them to, perhaps an idea if you've got a couple of 2.5-inch hard disk drives that you don't want on show. You can get rid of the drive cage altogether by removing a screw from the top in the motherboard tray and a couple of screws to the rear of the case, and once the screws are out of the way, the sled can be separated from the motherboard tray and lifted out of the case. As for the motherboard tray itself, there are a few features worth pointing out. First are the raised fixed standoffs formed as part of the motherboard tray. They're quite useful if you're going for a micro ATX motherboard, but I think they'd look a little unclean if you went for a mini ITX board. There's also a couple of optional standoffs which come with the case if your motherboard happens to need them. There's also a monumental cutout leaving plenty of space for fans and radiators, and if that's not enough of a hint, I don't know what is. And finally, there's a well-sized cutout behind the motherboard which should accommodate access for replacing most coolers on most motherboards without needing to remove the motherboard first. So that's the overview out of the way. Let's start off the build with the motherboard installation. Just to make life easier, the CPU's cooler has been pre-installed, and I've gone for the Scythe Mugen 5, but I will also be testing with the Noctua NHD15S before confirming my final decision on which cooler I'm selecting for the new 160mm plus clearance case testing system. Only comments that are worth reiterating here is that I wasn't required to install any standoffs. This avoids the potential for a standoff to strip the thread in the motherboard tray and be a problem all of its own. Moving on to the power supply unit, I'm going for a bracketless installation here since I really didn't feel it was necessary for a 160mm power supply unit, and it works completely fine without. It should be obvious, but as I mentioned earlier, the power supply unit will have to be mounted fan side out so it can breathe unless you go for an SFX power supply unit. In my case, this is a slight annoyance since this is a pretty cheap and oldish design that always has the fan spinning at an audible rate, and all that noise is being projected directly into the room, so it's worth checking your power supply unit's control if noise levels are of importance to you. Back to the 2.5-inch drive sleds. The installation of a drive into these is really quite straightforward. Slide the drive into position, add a couple of screws to the bottom, wonder if a screw is required or needed or beneficial in the sides at all, quickly realize it doesn't do anything, find out in the manual it doesn't mention anything about screws in the sides being required, then sit back wondering why there's a slot there at all. The manual actually alludes to a better way of installing drives into these sleds. First put all the sleds in place, then slot the drives into the sleds, and I've slotted the hard disk drive here to make a point, and then add the screws. The point I'm trying to make here is, why are all the bases of the drives on show and not the tops? SSD manufacturers create neat and sometimes even interesting designs to the top of their cases, and for some reason we're looking at the technical information business side and not the top fun party side. So I'm going to mirror this level of design and leave the back end of a hard disk drive on show. Remember, I could have put it in the hard disk drive cage hidden away, but then again, Thermaltake could have put the front on show and not the back. Linking them all up with power, I've gone for a few SATA power extenders that lead to the back, or lead forward to the back, to the SATA power cable. Since it'll all be on show, I'd rather present a consistent set of cables rather than awkwardly spread the standard 3 connector SATA cable from the power supply unit. Slotting the motherboard power cable was about as easy as it gets. In a lot of cases it's tricky to use the excess cable of such a large connector, but in cube style cases like this, cable management is generally easier. Back to the drives, they all need SATA data leads linking back to the motherboard. Again, this is a pretty simple task since there's so much room and accessibility, but this is where cable management issues start to creep in with such a large cutout. Something I've always preferred is a side-mounted I/O, since I always have the system on the desk, which is ideal when reviewing cases. So with the front I/O slotted and secured in place, the cables can be hooked up to the motherboard and tucked away where possible. Some cable management slots wouldn't be refused around the edges of this motherboard tray. Now onto the graphics card. To the back of the case is a plastic cover that can be pulled off to gain access to the PCI Express slot covers. As expected, all the slot covers are steel and can be removed and replaced. And from here there are no restrictions with installation, apart from leaving too much faith in the autofocus to do the right thing. Attempting to cut down on video length, the power was connected off camera and the base panel of the case can now be replaced. The front 200mm fan can also be replaced with the 4 included long screws, and now we can shift our attention to the front panel. Now something I wanted to do since the front I/O is now positioned on the side is to rotate the glass in the front panel so the Thermaltake logo remains horizontal, as it's not positioned very well to look great on its side. So freeing up the glass panel itself doesn't actually free up the mesh, which could have been removed before, and by extension we could have also accessed these screws that rather disappointingly are only there for the magnetic strip of the filtering mesh sheet. But there are a couple of clips to the sides of the panel that were only holding on the plastic curved accent panels, so nothing we've come across allows us to rotate the glass panel which has a logo permanently applied to it. I mean, to me it looks fantastic overall, and if it wasn't for the logo being imprinted on the glass, it would be perfect. And if this was a long-term system of mine, I would remove the logo somehow. I'm assuming chemicals overheat would be better, since it's glass. But since that's not an option right now, the panel is coming off and I'm returning the I/O to its original position, and with that, the front panel. And following those, both the side panels need replacing, as does the top panel. But before we move past the intricate details of the case onto thermals, I just wanted to point out that this case's front airflow isn't limited to a 15mm filtered strip either sides of the glass. The glass is offset about 15mm from the filter, allowing far higher airflow rates than would initially be thought.
So whether this makes it into the review video for the level 20 or a different video entirely, I'm at a crossroad when reviewing this level 20 now that I need to choose which cooler I'm using to review both this cooler and this case and every other case that can fit in up to 160mm cooler or larger. So it's a choice between the D15S and the Scythe Mugen 5. Now I've gone for the Scythe Mugen 5 at the moment. What I'm going to do is, this is after doing a bit of a poll with people on a separate video, which you can check out there. If I have space in my cards to put it, you can check it out there. And most people were going for the Scythe Mugen 5. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the Scythe Mugen 5 out for the D15S, test both, and then add that to the list of data for both of those coolers, so we have a bit of an understanding as to which one performs much better. If it turns out the D15S performs vastly better than the Mugen 5, I probably have no choice but to go for the D15S, but otherwise, if it's only a couple of degrees, then I'll probably be very tempted to go with the Mugen 5. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the coolers over now. So we start off with the Mugen 5, we're going to the D15S, and then I'm going to add in a pile of fans. Now, not every fan slot will be occupied, although we could occupy all fan spaces. I have, I think, a total of 8 Vardar fans, 820s and 3 140 Vardar fans. We could pack this thing full of fans, but massive amounts of testing will prove that, or do prove, that it is inefficient to do that. Not only are you using a lot more power and a lot more fans, and the cost per performance is out of whack, but you also have, if you put fans in here as at the top, as at the front, as an exhaust, then you're getting rid of air before it's even being used. So we'll probably be going for some sort of more front to rear style action here, but those fan positions up top will be definitely being used for our water cooling build in this case, and we've got huge amounts of radiators to throw into this thing to really see what it can do. So anyway, let's move on. I'm going to test both of them, and I'll give you the results right at the end, or when we go through the thermal testing, which will probably be quite close to this segment here. Right, so that's enough of me talking, so let's get on with the thermal testing.
So this is a bit all over the place, but up to this point you've seen the stock fan setup, which I ran through a single test being Prom95 small FFTs test for full CPU load and Furmark for full GPU load, just to see how it performed. So now I'm replacing the stock front 200mm fan with a couple 2200 RPM 120mm fans for increased airflow. I would have gone for two 140mm fans, but one of them is out of commission right now. However, unless I wanted to have the worst time trying to mount them to the front, they're being mounted to the inside of the chassis. But there's an issue. Since the front of the chassis has been pressed inwards and cut to leave a smooth front, there's a small ridge around all of the cutouts, and when the fan spins up it would lift and make contact with this ridge, and would more than likely break. This has happened to me in the past where a fan blade snapped off on the first boot. So we need to add some washers to increase the distance between the fan blades and the front of the chassis. I initially went for a single set of 1.4mm thick rubber washers, but that only leveled with the pressed ridge, so I ended up going for two washers for each screw for a total offset of roughly 2.8mm, which worked perfectly. Now Thermaltake isn't the only company to make this mistake, but this is by far the most expensive case I've come across with this design flaw. As for the rear of the case, I'm adding a 140mm fan, which should all in all give a relatively neutral airflow with around 260 meters cubed per hour intake that's being filtered, and a 180 meters cubed per hour exhaust that is not filtered. Now this is where I discovered the fan setup restrictions that aren't immediately obvious from a basic build or overview perspective. I wanted to add in a couple of 120mm fans to supply airflow directly to the graphics card, and while I did add the fans in, and the idea being adding in a couple of admittedly high airflow restricted fans could potentially help the graphics card even a little bit, the theory being that there was some potential use of the few millimeters of free area around the fan to accelerate the airflow into the graphics card heatsink, it turns out that upon replacing the side panel, the screw hole to the rear won't line up. Even with a decent push, it wasn't quite possible, and the reason behind this can be seen by looking from above with a highly increased exposure. It would appear that the tabs on the fan rails are preventing the panel from resting flush against the chassis. So from this we've learnt that while you can mount fan rails anywhere around the chassis, apart from the neighbouring panel to the power supply unit, there's also only provision for whichever side you place the top panel to be able to utilise them in terms of airflow and its physical mounting capability. So we've covered the stock and optimized cooling setups, but as I alluded to earlier, I'm not just testing this case with the Mugen 5 CPU cooler, I'm also running it with the NHD15S, which you can see the footage of now. Some points to be made here specific to the case and its design is that to change out the CPU cooler, you will need access to the back of the motherboard tray, if that wasn't obvious enough at this point. To do so requires the removal, or at least part removal, of the power supply unit, which I found to be perfectly acceptable and should still be perfectly serviceable with the power supply unit bracket in place. For comments specific to the installation of either the Mugen 5 or NHD15S, please head to their respective reviews in the CPU cooler review playlist. As for the thermal testing of these various setups, I just need to quickly explain and justify the lack of comparative data we'll be running through. Since we're in the transition phase of the various case testing systems, most of this data is completely irrelevant. So cutting out all the clearly incomparable data, we are left with the RVZ03 and the level 20 VT, as well as the base test results from the test bench. But even at this stage, the RVZ03 doesn't have an optimal cooler where the level 20 VT does, and it's a very small ITX case compared to a very large micro ATX case. Therefore, to not unintentionally mislead anyone, I'll just be comparing the level 20 VT results against the test bench, which should give you a good idea of the airflow resistance of this case. But bear in mind, all the results we're running through now are of the same system in different scenarios. So, starting things off with Prime 95, to go over some quick housekeeping rules, green represents GPU temperatures, blue represents CPU temperatures, and purple represents case volume in litres, which is how the graph is sorted. The test bench's volume is essentially limitless, so it's logged as 0, and there's an additional secondary sort by frames per second performance coming later, so the graphs will shift around a bit, but that may change in the future. All temperatures are recorded in degrees Celsius and are represented in a delta T format, meaning that ambient temperature of the room has been subtracted from the result of the respected temperature sensor. This makes a quick comparison much simpler, and you can even add the temperature of the room that you're in to get an idea of the standard operating temperature. All fans are set to full speed to eliminate fan curve variables, and to the end of each case's name is a suffix with a brief explanation of the cooling setup. An explanation of the suffix can be found at the top, as well as the basic specs of the system. So without further ado, what you've been looking at for the last minute or so is the results from the Prime 95 and Thermaltake 10-minute test. This graph is ordered primarily by case volume and then by CPU temperature, which shows us the D15S was the higher performer throughout on the test bench and in the level 20 VT. But I think it's really interesting that the level 20 VT with its standard single 200mm 800 RPM fan was only about 10 degrees behind the open air test bench, and swapping it out for a couple 2200 RPM 120mm fans and a rear 2000 RPM 140mm fan knocked off a good 8 degrees for the D15S and nearly 10 degrees for the Mugen 5. This places the level 20 VT only 2 or 3 degrees behind the open air test bench with the optimal fan setup. But these temperatures are only half of the true story, clocks are the other half. At these lowish true temperatures of around 60 degrees C or so, the clocks of the GPU are only just starting to drop off, but it looks like it's all within tolerance. As for the CPU, that will only thermal throttle past 100 degrees C, which we are well out of the range from. So from now on, I'm running through the test results from the Mugen 5 to keep everything a little more concise. Something we've not been able to do for a while is go through the Firestrike graphics runs, since we've been focused on CPU coolers for quite a long time now. Graphics test 1 shows us both the CPU and GPU are receiving some benefits from the additional faster fans. The fan swap knocked around 3 degrees Celsius off the CPU and GPU, but it has to be noticed that it was much louder running 3 2000-ish RPM fans compared to a single 200mm 800 RPM fan. Skipping past graphics test 2 over to the physics test, there was a noticeable benefit to the CPU's temperature after the fan swap, just over a 5 degrees Celsius improvement. You might be wondering why the GPU temps are higher on the test bench than in the case, and that's most likely down to the additional airflow from the case's fans, where the test bench didn't have any additional case fans. I could certainly do with creating an optimized test setup for the test bench to eliminate this issue. Skipping past the combined test and Unigine Heaven tests, we're going to check out the Unigine superposition results. The initial testing with the stock 200mm 800 RPM fan was looking good enough already in terms of GPU performance, and we don't need to look too closely at CPU performance in this test since it's very GPU load intensive. Anyway, GPU thermals were improved on by the extra fans to the tune of 8 degrees Celsius, very noticeable and well out of the way of tolerance. In Dirt 3 we saw a 3 degree improvement on the GPU and a 4 degree improvement on the CPU, but there were less improvements to be seen in Dirt Showdown. Rise of the Tomb Raider gave us minimal improvements in terms of GPU temps, but there were a few degrees of improvements in CPU temps with the extra fans. Hitman also found there were a few degrees of improvements to be had from swapping out the original fan, and the same can be said for GTA 5. In nearly all tests there tended to be a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius separation between the stock and optimal fan setup, and the same 3 to 4 degrees differences found between the optimal fan setup and the open air test bench. So there we have it. Very, very good thermals on this case, although it's very difficult to compare to other cases. But what we can tell is it's not very far from the test bench, which is an open air test bench, which is on the Thermaltake Core P3, and that pretty much, has all the air available it can to cool itself, minus having some sort of case or chassis fans to be able to supply air at a certain rate. But either way, 10 degrees at the worst case scenario with that standard 200mm fan is pretty damn solid, and I'm not surprised. Now, initially I thought that the front panel down the strip there, it only had two sort of strips of air that were filtered to allow air to come through, but it actually turns out that it opens up into the entirety of the full filtered front panel, which is fantastic, and that's a really great way of getting around having a really nice sort of block or aesthetic front panel, but also allowed the air to come through and have both performance and sort of aesthetics combined together to make a really solid product in terms of performance. So one thing I was just going to cover quickly is, why do I have two zones of lighting? Well, I didn't try. It just happened to. I bought another CableMod set because I lost the remote, and so I needed another one. So I thought I'd go and just get a 60cm strip, put the 60cm strip in the bottom, got 30cm strips around the top, and it just happens that connected to the same controller, they're just different colors. They swap zones. Red is fine, it's red everywhere, but then it swaps zones between there. So it looks great. I mean, it looks fantastic having two completely different colors, and then it merges in the middle. But I didn't try. But yeah, it looks good either way. So maybe an opportunity for you guys if you're gonna get this case to do something like that. And maybe even have two separate water loops that have water cooling in them. No, I wouldn't bother. Anyway, so we're going to quickly cover the pros, cons, positive, negatives, and some missed opportunities. So I'll cover the negatives first. The front fan mounting, it's really quite shocking, to be honest. There's no sort of interesting clips or anything that's provided in the case, so you just have to either fix them to the inside, and if you have it as intake, then the likelihood is with most fans that the fan blades could rise and start clipping onto the sort of bent or pressed and cut face that is on the inside, which has all these bits poking out. So you will need to create an offset, so having a couple of washers in there to act as spacers to do so, like I did. Something that I'm a little bit disappointed in with this case is cable management wise. It kind of looks like it would suit a basement, but obviously because there's tempered glass, you'd just be blocking off half your view, so I understand why that's not the case. And there are holes around here, although it doesn't seem that cable management around those little holes in the front would look very good. So I would have liked to see some cable management channels where you could perhaps hook or just, sort of hide cables through the runs in some sort of bent pressed metal around the bottom of the motherboard tray. That would have been nice to have. So that's pretty much it for the cons though. You could say material wise, you would have liked some more premium materials instead of some sort of plastics and stuff like that. That doesn't really bother me. I think plastics are way more durable, so you're not going to have any issues with finish, maintaining. If you scratch plastic, then you can always sort of just very gently sort of scuff it out a bit and it will look generally okay, or you can go down the entire run and sort of, sand it all out. So I wouldn't say that's negative. I think in all intents and purposes, in terms of durability, it's kind of a positive. So in terms of pros, in terms of positives, the tempered glass, obviously a great positive, and for the price of around £100, I definitely think this amount of tempered glass is very reasonable, considering there's a lot of plastic around. There are these I didn't actually mention, the screws. They are actually plastic covered screws, and again, those don't bother me at all. I think that's completely acceptable, and they're actually very easy to sort of install and remove. So good front panel airflow, like I said just before. So yeah, very solid thermals that come through. Obviously the front panel being filtered is the most important one. Radiator support, fantastic radiator support, and we will be further delving into this when we put two 240mm radiators up top with four 120mm fans, and then we're throwing the original or the stock 200mm fan in here, and we'll be coupling it with a Phobia 200mm radiator. So we're going to be exploring that, but great radiator support, and of course the rails themselves, actually those rails are really quite usable, but of course you can't couple the rails to support fans or radiators when you have side panels here. These, specifically side panels. Top panel has a gap around all the edges, so you have intake or exhaust, but the side panels just don't, so I wouldn't even go there, and having it on the underside is a complete no-go. So yeah, pros and cons here or there maybe. But anyway, LED lighting support I think is great as well, because you have this chassis that is sort of maintaining this cube-based cuboid, or square-based cuboid. Then you have these nice chassis pieces that you can slot LED lights into. Some people ask when I do these reviews, do the LED lights come with the chassis or the case? No, they don't. That'll be an extra expense if that's something you're into. So, missed opportunities. This is by far... I've got as many missed opportunities as pros, which is not great. So side panel ventilation, I think they could have done a little bit there to perhaps just add in just some ventilation, possible ventilation segments, sections to the top and bottom of them, maybe towards the front and back somehow. It would have been nice to have, because I think you would have been able to make a lot more use of these rails. But again, obviously there's only 2 sets of rails, so you can only support 2 rows of whatever you're going to be supporting. In terms of the front panel, I think the logo at the front, it just doesn't work. You either have to put the logo down away from center, but if you have it slight offset from center, which you can see at the front there, then when you slant it on its side, it just doesn't look like it should be in the right place. If it was down to the side and you slanted it sidewards, it would look like it's either reading from the top across or from the bottom up, and it would make more sense. But being central like that is a bit of a sort of, yeah, what's it really supposed to be? So having it mounted, having the whole front panel mounted sideways isn't really much of an option if that thing annoys you. It doesn't really annoy me, but to some people it does, and I want to sort of, make that apparent by changing it back to what it was. Unfortunately, you can't rotate that front glass panel. I think that should be an option. That's definitely a missed opportunity. So in terms of the 2.5-inch drive mounting orientation, that's just a weird one to me. Now, you can flip it round, or just to recap if nobody knows, its standard orientation is that you have the base of the SSD available and on show, where you really would want the top because it's better designed, it looks nicer. But what you can do is unscrew them, flip them round and have them without the screws in. So that'll work for SSDs, no problem. But if you have a 2.5-inch hard disk drive, that might be a little bit more problem. Again, I mean, 2.5-inch hard disk drives are generally used in mobile, so you can, shift it around and nothing's crashed of the programs that run on the 2.5-inch hard disk drive. So, it's relatively okay and you can shift it around and it's not going to kill anything. But, it would have been nice if they've supported that sort of from the get-go to have the front on show or the top on show of the 2.5-inch drives. Front 120mm fan placement, I think, is a slight missed opportunity that they didn't go for, and a lot of different cases do this. They'll go central, but they won't give you options for potentially mounting 4 at the front, so that was really awful. So just having 2 at the top and then 2 at the bottom there, and then just having those 4 in like an array, so that you can really, tune where you want the airflow to go. So I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity that they could have added in, but it would have added a little bit more complication to manufacturing and the design. But I think still, I would log it down as a missed opportunity because it wouldn't be too hard to implement. And then final thing then, cable management, I think it's a missed opportunity that they didn't do a bit more with that, like I mentioned in the cons. So, is it worth £100? Well, what else can you get for £100? Well, you can get the Define Mini C Tempered Glass Edition for under £100, and I think it's actually comparable to that. I think it's missing things that are, nice to haves. So a little bit of sort of quality of presentation, things like that. It's missing a bit here and there. But I think, would I buy this for £100? Yeah. Yeah, I would buy this for £100, I think. But yeah, I think it looks fantastic. I think you can do a lot more with it. There's so much more support than there is in lots of other cases around £100. So it's really worth considering. And if you do like it based on this review, then again, those Amazon affiliate links are in the video description. And if you check them out or, buy anything through them, then again, we get a small kickback. And I can use that, obviously, to do, different things with stuff on this channel. Although I don't think I should necessarily say so. But anyway, thank you so much for checking this one out. If you want to support this video, then you can give it a like. Or if you dislike it, then please let me know what you didn't like, and if you liked, please let me know what you did like, and I'll know what to be able to retain or get rid of for future reviews to make them better. If you have any questions about this case that I didn't cover, things that I didn't quite cover, then please let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to help out and answer. I'm going to do my best over the last 6 days. I've not been so good at keeping up with comments and stuff, so I'm going to try my best to maintain that. I have been pretty good in the past, but not so over the last 6 days or so. So if you do ask anything, then I'll do my best to answer it in the comments. And if you want to support this channel any further, then you can always join the Patreon and add whatever you fancy. Any small amount will make a big difference, so it allows me to do things like buy more interesting things and cover it in more interesting ways. So thank you so much for checking this one out. I really hope you enjoyed it. And one thing I don't actually mention enough, I don't say enough, is thanks for the opportunity to be able to do this. Now, people who subscribe to this channel, who have been subscribed for a long time, or new subscribers, which you may be one of them, I don't say enough to you guys that you give me a platform to be able to create or make creative videos, make creative content, to be able to just be creative. So you know, the more support I get in sort of those regards and those factors, you know, the better I can be in the future. So I really appreciate that, and I don't say it enough, so I probably should say it at the end of every video. They don't come out often enough, really. I mean, I am I'm working as fast as I can on these things, but realistically for a YouTube channel, it should be like once a week all the time. And this is kind of like once a week, hopefully. So anyway, thanks so much for checking this one out. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got all the information you wanted, and I'll catch you in the next one, which will be water cooling the level 20 VT. I was going to say the R9390X. We did that last time, actually. If you want to check that live stream, you can go to the live streams in the top right-hand corner. But anyway, see you guys.